Hey, my name is Mike. I'm a developer from Philadelphia, and in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the Attribution Queries SQL project. In this project, we're going to take a look at some of these key concepts, including using aggregation functions, using the distinct keyword, and using the join keyword. Without further ado, let's head into Codecademy and we'll get started. Here on the Codecademy screen, on the left, we have our instructions. In the middle is our text editor, where we're going to be writing all of our SQL queries. And then over here on the right is our database schema, and also where all of the results of our queries are going to show up. Let's take a look at the project description. It says, Attribution Queries. Cool t-shirts sells shirts of all kinds, as long as they are T-shaped and cool. Recently, CTS started a few marketing campaigns to increase website visits and purchases. Using touch attribution, they'd like to map their customer's journey from initial visit to purchase. They can use that information to optimize their marketing campaigns, and this project will guide you through some of that process. This is part 2 of the first and last touch attribution capstone. At this point, you should have taken part 1, the lesson on touch attribution, and this part will guide you through a number of queries on cool t-shirts user data, and you can see the schema here. And then also, we're going to make sure to save the query results because we may be using them in part 3, the formal presentation of our findings. So we'll check out the steps as we go. And let's get started. So basically, the first step to this was the actual lesson on touch attribution, and then this is the second part, which is part of our capstone project. We have 6 tasks in total that we want to complete, so let's get started. Here on step number 1, we're just going to get familiar with cool t-shirts. So actually, before we do step number 1, if you look over here, this is the query for the first touch data that we wrote in part 1. So like I said, part 1 was the actual lesson, and this was written in the lesson. So if you haven't done the lesson, I would recommend going back and doing that. I'm going to get rid of this though, so we can make room for step number 1. So step number 1 says, how many campaigns and sources does cool t-shirts use? Which source is used for each campaign? Use the 3 queries to figure it out. So we're going to write 3 queries. The first one is going to be for the number of distinct campaigns. So real quick, if you just click save, then over here, the database schema should pop up, and this will kind of help us to write this first one. So we're going to write a query that just counts how many distinct campaigns we have. Whenever we want to count something in SQL, we always want to use the count function. And in this case, we're trying to count the number of distinct campaigns. So we're going to be counting, and then inside of here, we'll count the number of distinct UTM campaigns, just like that. And then we'll count that from the page visits table. So if I run this now, we should figure out how many there are. So it looks like there's 8 unique campaigns that we're currently running. So that's the first part here. And the second part, we're going to write a query for the number of distinct sources. So this is essentially the same query. I'm going to copy this. We'll paste it down here. Except instead of the campaign, we're going to go ahead and use the source. So if I save this, we should see the number of distinct sources. So there's 6 distinct sources running 8 distinct campaigns. And now for the last step here, we want to find out how both of these things are related. So I want to figure out which campaigns are running on which sources. And in order to do that, we can just select distinct, and we'll select both of these. So we'll select the distinct campaign, and then we'll select the source that it's running on. So we'll select that from page visits. So now we should get a list of all of the campaigns here on the left and all of the sources on the right, so we can kind of see how they relate. So for example, New York Times is running the Getting to Know Cool T-Shirts campaign. BuzzFeed is running the 10 Crazy Cool T-Shirts facts. Then email is the weekly newsletter campaign. Facebook is the retargeting ad, etc. So that's how all of these relate to each other. That's step number 1. We can check that off, and we'll head on to step number 2. Step number 2 says, what pages are on the cool t-shirt website? Find the distinct values of the page name column. This is very similar to these queries. I'm going to get rid of these top 2, and we'll just use this one as the sort of template. So now instead of selecting distinct UTM campaigns and UTM sources, we're going to select distinct page names because we want to find all the distinct page names in the table. So now when I click save, you can see we have page 1, which is the landing page, then the shopping cart page, the checkout page, and the purchase page. So real quick, I do want to point out this purchase page here, the user is only going to land on that purchase page after they've purchased something. So if the user's on this page, then we can be certain that they've actually purchased something. And that'll come up later in one of our future queries, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how that worked. So let's check off number 2, and we'll move on to step number 3, which says, what is the user journey? How many first touches is each campaign responsible for? you'll need to use the first touch query from the lesson, also provided in the hint below, group by campaign and count the number of first touches for each. So we're going to take that first touch query that we wrote in the first part of this, which was the actual lesson, and we can get that from down here since we deleted it. So I'm going to copy this and we'll paste this over here. So here's the first touch query. Now, this isn't all we want though. We want to group by campaign and we want to count the number of first touches for each. So why don't we start with that first part? Let's group by the campaign. Down here below the join, I'm going to put the group by. Now, real quick, before I do this, just know that there's a million different ways that you could write a query like this. So the way that I'm doing it right here isn't the only way that it's possible to do this. And if you find a different way that you think is a little bit better or that works better for you, then you can do that. I'm just going to be doing it this way though, because I think it's the most straightforward way to do it. So down here below the join, I'm going to group by, and we're going to group by the campaign. So I'm going to group by the UTM campaign. That's the first part. And then the second part says we want to count the number of first touches for each. So for each one of these campaigns, we want to figure out how many first touches there were. So up here in this select, you can see we're selecting 4 things. So I'm going to select one more thing down here below, and we'll just select the count. And remember, we want to count how many first touches there were. So we can count by the UTM campaign as well. Now let's save this, and here's the results over here. So we have here our count, and actually, why don't I order these just so it's a little bit easier to read. So I'll order them by this count right here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the 5th thing we're selecting. I'll order them by 5 in descending order. So now you can see here the campaign and then how many first touches it got. So the Getting to Know Cool T-Shirts campaign had 612 first touches. The Cool T-Shirts search campaign had 169 first touches. So that's step number 3. We can check that off, and we'll head down to step number 4, which says, how many last touches is each campaign responsible for? Starting with the last touch query from the lesson, group by campaign and count the number of last touches for each. So essentially, we're going to be doing the same exact thing that we're doing here, but instead of first touches, we're going to do this with last touches. Now, in the first part of this, in the actual lesson on this, we ended up writing the last touch query. And so you should have that last touch query ready to go if you did that lesson. But if not, I'll show you guys how we can write it. It's basically the same exact query, except instead of min here, we're going to change this to max. So now we want the last timestamp. And then I'm going to change all of this first stuff into last. So instead of saying first touch, I'll say last touch. And then we'll just change all that stuff. So last touch at, and then down here, we'll do the same thing. So anywhere that it's saying first, I'm going to change it to last. All right, so I changed all the first touch stuff into last touch stuff, and then I also changed the FT here into LT. So now when I save, instead of getting the first touch stuff, we should get all of the last touch stuff. So I'm going to save. So here's all the information for last touches. So like the weekly newsletter campaign had 447 last touches. The retargeting campaign had 245 last touches. So that's how we can write this same query, but for last touches. So we'll check off step number 4. And then head down to step number 5, which says, how many visitors make a purchase? Count the distinct users who visited the page named for purchase. So this isn't directly related to this query that we just wrote. I am going to keep this in, however, because for the next step, we're going to be using this same query. But down here below this, we'll do step number 5. So it says, how many visitors make a purchase? So we can select, and we want to count the number of users that make a purchase. So we can count distinct, and we'll count user ID because that'll give us each user. So right here, we're counting each of the users, and we know that they've made a purchase when they end up on this for purchase page. So we can go ahead and filter this. So I'm going to select this from the page visits table, and then we can say where, and I'm going to say page name is equal to this. So if they're on this page, then that will tell us that they bought something. So let's save. And then over here, we have our count. So this is the number of distinct users that actually bought something. It's hard to kind of see here because this is blocking it, but it's 361. So 361 users. So that's step number 5. And now in step number 6, we're going to kind of integrate these two queries together. So it says, how many last touches on the purchase page is each campaign responsible for? This query will look similar to your last touch query, but with an additional where clause. So basically, we want to keep this same exact query here, but we want to add in this where clause to it. So I want to filter this out so we're only getting the last touches for the purchase page. So I'm actually just going to cut this part out here. We'll get rid of this, and we can put this where right up here. So right here where we're creating this kind of last touch table where it says like last touch as, and then this whole thing. With this table, we're going to filter it so that we only get those that have the page name as for purchase. So now when I save, you'll see over here that we get the count for the campaigns, but this is only for those last touches that had the page name equal to for purchase. So that's step number 6. We'll check that off. And that was the last step. So we are done with this part of our capstone project. Let's kind of touch on some of the main points that we looked at. So this was our main query that we were working with, and we used it to get the first touches, and then we also used it to get the last touches. And with the first touches, we had min right here, and then with the last touches, we had max. And that's because min would give us the first timestamp, and then max would give us the last timestamp. We ended up grouping them by campaign, just like we have over here, and then we counted how many were for each campaign. Also in this query, we used the join keyword in order to join both of those tables together, and that kind of was how all of this came together. So that's a quick overview of what we did. I hope you guys learned something, and from all of us here at Code Academy, I've been Mike, and I just want to say happy coding.